So try to look like you're having a good time. Okay, so we have I'm in Los Angeles, and I'm about to explain the philosophical news about the paper I'm going to deliver at the University of Florida. So we'll introduce everyone. Maybe you can just say what your name is and how much you plan to give me after the talk. I'm just kidding. That was a joke.
Hi, I'm Brisa.
Who just graduated from USC, one of the best schools in America.
Divya.
She's a regular. Robin.
Golan Girasa. Marisha.
And that gentleman over there.
Tyrone.
So we're here in Los Angeles, and I'm going to have a little darshan, as we call it in this business. And so I thought I'd invite everybody to participate. I'm going to be giving a paper at the University of Florida. I'm one of the keynote speakers. I just bragged. At this big national conference on science, consciousness in science. Consciousness is kind of a, it's a dog whistle for religion. So I thought I'd tell you some things I plan to talk about. For those of you who listen to my lectures, it makes me feel good. It does wonders for my self-esteem. Just kidding. But I've explained many times, many lectures, how we live in a bidimensional universe. To explain what I mean by that, I'll give one example from history. Darwin in 1859 published Origin of Species, which was a big sensation. It immediately kind of provoked this huge battle, cultural war, especially because there was a gentleman named Thomas Huxley, who was known even in his time as Darwin's bulldog. He was a very prominent, one of the most prominent scientists in England and in education, actually. In fact, he was head of the Royal Society for Science, and he's a very prominent figure, but he was just sort of this tenacious, in-your-face, take no prisoners polemicist who was also kind of atheistic and wanted to really free people from religion. I'm going to cover sort of rapidly in my talk the history of the relationship between science and religion. It's a talk I gave at Stanford several years ago, if you want to look it up. But of course, up until around 1600, or up until, let's say, the 1500s, everyone followed. Can you turn off that light at the back? Penny saved is a penny earned. Aristotle, ever since Thomas Aquinas in the High Middle Ages, just before the Renaissance, Aristotle was kind of like the house philosopher for the Catholic Church. At a time when there was only one church in Europe, really, certainly Western Europe and Central Europe, which was the Catholic Church. That's all right. So Thomas Aquinas had sort of sanitized Aristotle, in the sense that they say sometimes Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica actually sort of baptized Aristotle. He took Aristotle's system and he sort of Christianized it. And that became the official doctrine eventually of the Catholic Church. It was controversial at the time because Aristotle had one enormous disqualification, which is that he was a pagan. He had never been baptized. Of course, he appeared about 300, 400 years before Jesus, but never mind. So they kind of gave him a pass on that, on those grounds. So this was a revival. This was kind of like the proto-Renaissance. I mean, I think you have to look at Thomas Aquinas around, I guess he's in the 1200s or something. Yeah, and in the next century, the Renaissance is going to begin. So it's kind of like the proto-Renaissance, where people are starting to think, well, wait a second, we don't really have to be stuck in this Monty Python movie, the Dark Ages, and it's not a coincidence that the Renaissance began in Italy, because Italy was, especially Rome, had been the center of Western civilization. And so it's just like, for example, there's a lot more interest in America in, let's say, Native American societies, and a lot more college courses taught on it than, let's say, in Luxembourg or Japan or even, let's say, in Argentina. They're not going to teach that many courses on the native inhabitants of North America because, you know, it's our country. And the same thing, if you go to other countries, you'll find they teach a lot of things about their history that aren't so interesting to people in other countries. So for the people in Italy, this was our civilization. These were our ancestors. I won't use, you know, chauvinist, sexist terms like forefathers. So, but anyway, so the Renaissance actually began in Italy. And really before, I mean, generally the Renaissance is said to have begun around 1300s. But by the 1200s, I think Thomas Aquinas was already, as I say, baptizing Aristotle. He was looking to Aristotle for wisdom about how to present Christ, the revelation. And so the idea that a pagan, by the way, yeah, what I said, Thomas Aquinas, I'm a guru, so I don't make mistakes. And when I apparently do, it's the mistake of the listener. So no matter what kind of evidence the listener has. So Thomas Aquinas was born in 1225 and died in 1274. Not a long life. He died actually at the age of 49. Anyway, so if you think of the Dark Ages, Europe doesn't know what the hell's going on anywhere else. Like, for example, as late as Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese explorer who went to India, and I'll give you a date because you're all very eager to know the date for Vasco da Gama. He basically around 1500. Around 1500, he went to India. And I swear to God, as late as 1500, this is like, we're already like sort of, not at the end of the Renaissance, but already kind of, sort of like, you know, it's a third quarter. If the Renaissance was a football game, it's a third quarter. And so as late as 1500, everyone in Europe thought that everyone in India was Christian. And the reason is because, first of all, Europeans would never actually go to India, and most people couldn't read, and they didn't know what was going on in other parts of the world, because there was a legend that an apostle of Jesus went to India, and of course it was typical hagiography. We have kind of these exaggerated stories of miracles performed by saints. Never have anything like that among us. So there was a story that an apostle went to India, apostle of Jesus, and just converted everybody. So Vasco da Gama went to India. He landed in the southwest, on the southwest coast, sort of below Goa. He saw real, you know, real estate opportunities there in Goa. Kind of, you know, very far seen. Just kidding. But anyway, so he landed in the southwest coast of India, and there was a little temple there. It's interesting because in India, certainly unlike North America, you don't have all the major cities on the coast, which was all commercial, of course. And in Europe, all the major cities are on rivers, which is also commercial. I mean, in communication. So India was kind of like, for a long time, had been this very inward-looking culture. And so there just weren't any important centers on the coast or cities, which is one reason the Europeans kind of were able to get a foothold, because no one cared that much what's going on the coast. The Indians were obviously not medieval surfers. And so anyway, so Vasco da Gama got there, and he found this little mandir, this little temple of Shakti, the goddess. And he assumed it was a temple of Mary, the Virgin Mary. So he and all his men, he was coming from Portugal. The Renaissance had not reached Portugal. Portugal was like, it was kind of like a place where, you know, sort of flat earthers. And so he thought he was worshiping the Virgin Mary. And then after a while, he realized it's not the Virgin Mary. It's one of these pagan gods. So he just did the only decent thing to do. He sort of, you know, killed everybody and then moved on. But you got to love colonialism. So anyway, what was I getting at? So you have this revival. So people didn't know about other places. That was my point. They had no idea what was going on in India. They thought the Indians were all Christians, and that shows how much they knew. And so, ironically, one of the ways that Europe first kind of had more contact with the world and started to, these seeds were planted for more of a global vision of what the world really is, was due to this horrific event, the Crusades. You know, as evil as the Crusades were, and there was a lot of evil to go around in the Crusades, still they were having contact with non-Europeans, and the Islamic Renaissance, of course, began long before the European Renaissance, because about 1,000 years ago, 900 years ago, whatever, actually up until, who was it? I think it was Attila the Hun kind of messed up everything. Everything was exactly the opposite. I mean, the terrorists were all the Western Europeans. If you look at the 100 Years' War, it was just English terrorism against France, and they called it that. I mean, they were proud to be terrorists. And so, and the sort of the more advanced civilization, more cosmopolitan, more learned, was the Islamic world. Unfortunately, not the Muslims that invaded India, but more to the west. Anyway, so so if you look at the relationship back then between science and religion, first of all, religion totally dominated everything. The church, the Roman Catholic Church, just dominated. I mean, not only did they tell everybody what they could think and couldn't think about God or the soul or the most important things of life, but to use a phrase that was very common back then, the church would tell you how to go to heaven and how the heavens go. In other words, if you want to know astronomy, or if you want to know geology, or if you want to know anything, because virtually every school in Europe was a church school. There was no such thing as a secular school. All the great universities in Europe were founded by the church. That goes back to Charlemagne, that's another story. So, there's no secular education, there's no such thing. There are only church schools, there are only church colleges. And so the church will tell you how to go to heaven and how the heavens go. And so what happened? What went wrong here with this nice little picture? Well, someone did something really irresponsible, wasn't thinking, and invented the printing press. So that was like in the 1470s or something. So, by the way, all of these things I'm about to describe happened immediately before, during, or immediately afterwards the advent of Lord Chaitanya. So literally, around the time Lord Chaitanya came, the whole Western world totally was transformed. So the printing press. And so naturally, if you're living back then, what are you going to print? 3 guesses, the Bible. It's like, obviously, that's what you're going to print. And you're not going to print Fox News, you're going to print the Bible. So they did print the Bible. And then you have Martin Luther. In the church, of course, monopolies tend to be fat and corrupt, and that's just what monopolies tend to do. If you've got the only hardware store in town, and the next hardware store is 70 miles down the road, you don't like my hardware? You don't like my prices? Sure, drive 140 miles round trip. Save a few bucks. No, I'll be with you. No, I can't talk to you right. So monopoly. So the church had a monopoly. And so therefore science was all nice, because everyone, there's no question of opposing the church unless you had a very strong death wish. So there was no question of opposing the church. And the church was really managing the Renaissance. That's something you have to understand. The church was managing the Renaissance, even though it was a rebirth, a renaissance. It was a rebirth of Europe, of pagan culture. But the people weren't, at least all of them weren't idiots, and they could see that actually they were really smart back then. They had incredible literature. They had all kinds, fiction, nonfiction, essayists. Really brilliant. One thing you have to understand: classical antiquity, the Greco-Roman civilization. Those people, if you actually read what they wrote and get to know them, they're much more like us than what came later. If you look at after the fall of Rome, the Dark Ages, the lower Middle Ages, High Middle Ages, even the Renaissance, early Renaissance. There are some ways in which the people back in antiquity were really like us. They talked like us. They thought like us. I mean, it was very interesting. And this Renaissance began in Florence, Italy, in the 1300s. People like Petrarch and Dante, and then it really started to catch fire. And people started to realize that this world is not just sort of dark and gloomy and useless, and our bodies are really nasty and ugh. But actually, you know, there's a lot of beauty in the world. There's a lot of beauty in nature. There's human life being very interesting. God gave us the power to think, and they began to access all these old classical ideas, like the logos, which was very popular back in antiquity. The idea that logos, you know, logic, logos means sort of a rational explanation of something, like physiology, geology, biology, and so on. And so they were rediscovering all this, and so the logos means that God. It's very interesting. They had this very strong idea. Pagans, by the way, there were monotheistic pagans before Christianity. There were actually monotheists. There were, anyway, I won't get started on that, of the overall effect that that period of history had on the world. But anyway, so they were, they saw God, many of them, as the supremely rational being. I mean, God is kind and all that, but God is also supremely rational. It was like, and there's a distinction I make between philosophical monotheism and tribal monotheism. In Europe, there was philosophical monotheism. And obviously, if you're a philosophical monotheist, and so am I, I may call it Krishna, someone else may call it something else, but we have the same philosophy. And so if what you care about is philosophy, and you meet another philosophical monotheist, yeah, we can really get along. But if you are a tribal monotheist, then it's very different. Tribal monotheism means my God can beat up your God. That this is the God of our tribe. This is the God of our people. It's sectarian, it's fanatical, it's not concerned with philosophy as much as it's concerned with sort of unique historical events. Philosophy is universal. For example, if I believe there's an eternal soul and you believe that, we can be in different religions and different times, historical periods, we can be in different parts of the world, but we're doing the same thing. We're connected. Whereas if you say the Son of God appeared, at this particular time in this place, and I say Krishna appeared in Mathura, the nature of history is that everything happens only one time, unless you're into some of these cuckoo ideas of eternal return. But anyway, so historical events are unique. Philosophical ideas are universal, they're saying. And so there's philosophical, and so if you look at this is a point I'm going to make in my talk, actually, that one of the very strong cultural components of ancient civilization was syncretism. Syncretism, which means that we're worshiping the same God with different names. And this was like the culture. There was, in fact, something called the interpretazione Greco and Romano, the Greek interpretation of the Greek translation of the Roman translation. What it means is that when the Greeks or the Romans came upon other civilizations, they would figure out the correspondence. In other words, you say Zeus. Okay, we say Jupiter. In other words, they would match up their pantheon with the culture they had come in contact with. For the Romans, it was absolutely necessary because you try managing dozens and dozens of countries, each one with dozens of religions, and so the Romans, they didn't rule simply by brute force. They were actually intelligent, and they understood that there's like tens of millions of them and far fewer of us. It's like if you're an elephant rider, you don't really want to get the elephant very mad. And so the Romans had this policy of syncretism. It was like the carrot and the stick, because the Romans had two things. They were syncretistic, They were tolerant. They promoted, any religion that wasn't just really weird, which is what they thought of Christianity. I'll explain why. On the other hand, if someone did rebel, they would really make them an example. If someone did rebel against Rome, they would hit you so hard that everyone else would think, hey, you want to rebel? Nope, I don't want to rebel. You want to rebel? Nope, I don't want to rebel. So that was kind of like the carrot-stick strategy that Rome used. So they had this syncretism. Alexander the Great was another one. He actually wanted to unite East and West. Of course, he hadn't read Rudyard Kipling. East is East and West is West. So you have this very cosmopolitan, religiously tolerant society with this syncretism, because after all, it's Mediterranean Vedic culture, naturally. And so what happened, then you get this, in some ways, I really don't want to be offensive or to anyone, but kind of like this poison pill, which was Middle Eastern fanaticism, came into Europe. And everyone was just kind of like, oh my God. Because when you start getting this toxic language like, we worship a living God, you worship a dead God, we have a true religion, you have a false religion. And these are people who for centuries and centuries, oh, your God is named such and such. Let me figure out what that corresponds to in my philosophy. Because there's only one God. We're all worshiping the same God. So a civilization that just took it for granted that there's one God and that people just have different ways of worshiping that one God. And here these like really hot and heavy people come from the Middle East saying that you're worshiping dead gods and everything you're doing is false and you're going to hell. People are like looking at each other like, seriously? Anyway, how Christianity actually spread has to do with the fact that the Roman Empire started to have major problems and everything kind of got, anyway. But so before the Christians being adopted by Constantine in the 4th century, no one really fought religious wars. They really didn't have religious wars. They had political wars and economic, they'd fight for the sort of, old-fashioned reasons like greed, lust for power, and all that kind of stuff, but not religious wars. The Romans weren't fighting to bring Jupiter to other people. That's not why they were fighting. In fact, there was a tremendous amount of borrowing. Actually, what the Romans would have considered foreign religions actually flourished in Rome. And if you look at a lot of, in fact, the same thing in Christianity. Who's that? Osiris? The idea that God sent his son to earth to be martyred, to be killed, to pay for the sins of the world. And after so many days, his son rose into heaven. That was from Egypt. That had been going on in Egypt for centuries. But anyway, so there's a lot of borrowing going on, and that's a whole issue of what happened when, for various historical reasons I explained many times, the Jesus movement, which during the life of Jesus and during the years immediately after Jesus, was composed exclusively of Jewish people, and Roman historians had no religious interest in it. Everyone just took it for granted that it's a Jewish movement, because Judaism was much more diverse back then. In fact, the brother of Jesus, James, was an Orthodox Jew who went to the synagogue every day, and he was an apostle. So anyway, there's all this borrowing and sharing, and even the idea that of giving Jesus an upgrade, that, okay, actually he's God, that was another pagan thing. As pagans took over the Jesus movement, they paganized it. And so among pagans, no one would take your religion seriously if your leader didn't become a god when he died. In fact, any important person became a god when he died. Julius Caesar. The Roman Senate would officially vote that someone was now a god. And people would have deities and put the deities on their altar and everything. But anyway, so if you look at the relationship between religion and what you call science or proto-science or just philosophy, because after all, science used to be a branch of philosophy. That's why if you get a PhD in biology, it's called a doctor of philosophy. You get a PhD in, let's say, geology, it's a doctor of philosophy. Why? Because philosophy meant originally just an advanced study in any branch of human wisdom or human knowledge. And so, so originally, all the sciences, what we would call the sciences, they called it natural philosophy. That's what it was called up until fairly recently. Those things were all called natural philosophy. So, so the relationship, I mean, everyone, so getting back to the point of Aristotle, going back to the Renaissance now, which is, again, people trying to revive this pagan culture, which in many ways was obviously much more advanced than what the Europeans had in the Dark Ages. And so, so Aquinas looked at Aristotle and he had this total, oh my God moment, because Aristotle was really smart and the father of modern logic and just laid it all out. And so Aristotle was a total rock star in Europe. And even before that, he had been the big star of the Islamic Renaissance, which came earlier. In fact, to show you an example of the Islamic Renaissance, I mean, all the words that start with al, like algebra, alcohol, alkaline, that's all Arabic. All means the, you know, it's like alkaline, algebra, alcohol, that's all Arabic. Because they were actually the leaders in science. But in any case, so so you have this Renaissance coming, and so the relationship of science and religion, or science and philosophy and reason, everyone just followed Aristotle, because Aristotle had one book he called the Physics, meant just, you know, what we call material science, and then he had another book which his followers, when they published it, they called it the Metaphysics, because meta means beyond or after, and because the metaphysics dealt with Aristotle's conception of God as an unmoved mover, and that's so Aristotle. It's like God which fulfills a logical requirement. Okay, the argument from contingency, which actually begins, there's the argument for God. Contingent means it depends. Like if I say, are you coming tomorrow? Well, that's contingent. It means, well, it depends on something else. And so the argument from contingency is that in this universe, everything that we know about, everything, whether they're distant galaxies or your toenail, that's kind of gross. Anyway, everything we know about in this universe is contingent. It came from something else. Everything that we know about in the universe, let's we won't talk about souls here, let's talk about empirical things. Anything you can detect with your senses in the universe is in the middle of a causal chain. It came from something else and is going to produce something else. And so therefore the question is, and Prabhupada used to sort of give his simple version of it, your father, his father, his father. And so you could say, well, what if the universe has always existed? There's two problems with that. Well, one problem is it doesn't answer the real question. The real question is, why does anything exist? Why does anything exist? Because if there's nothing but contingent things, we could imagine, it's kind of awful, but we could imagine that nothing ever existed. Nothing ever came into existence. And so if we only have contingent things in this world, why does anything exist? And if you say that, well, it's just, you know, it's like the universe has existed forever, it's always been this way, that's a non-explanation. It's not really addressing the issue. If everything depends on something else, where does it all come from? And why does anything at all exist? So Aristotle, actually, he didn't call it that, but he gives a form of that, because Aristotle is, you know, he's a logician, he is into botany, and you know, like when his most famous student, Aristotle's most famous student was, of course, Alexander the Great. And so therefore, to please his teacher, when Alexander went gallivanting around conquering the world, he brought scientists along, or what they would call that, to sort of gather specimens of flora and fauna to send back to Aristotle so he could study them. So Plato is all about the eternal realm. In Plato, this world is just a perverted reflection of the eternal world. Whereas in Aristotle, this world's cool. So he wants to know about this world. So Aristotle says that, basically from the argument from contingency, Aristotle says that everything in this world is cause and effect. Something is moving something else, because the Greeks would sort of focused on motion. Causality is motion. And so therefore, there must be an unmoved mover. There must be an original cause of everything that is not caused, which of course is in the Brahma Samhita, that sarva karana karanam, cause of all causes. Ishvara Parama Krishna Satyanda Vigraha Anadiradi. He's the origin, he has no origin. So basically, on logical grounds, Aristotle realizes there must be a God. It's not the kind of God that's really going to, start a religion like you pray to him and he's merciful. It's just a logical necessity, but that's Aristotle. So Aristotle has this unmoved mover. So Aristotle, calls his work on material nature physics, and then his students, understanding what he was doing, calls his next book Metaphysics, what's beyond physics. And everybody thought, that sounds right. So everybody went with that. And because Aristotle was like, after Aquinas, Aristotle became the philosopher, the explainer of everything for the only church in Europe, that was it. So obviously the relationship between physics and metaphysics was just dandy. They were just two branches of knowledge. It's like, imagine a world in which biologists went to war with psychologists, and somehow either geology is true or psychology is true. They can't both be true. I mean, that's really stupid. And obviously, if they ever got to that point of imbecility, it would have to be based on psychological reasons. Something happened between them that couldn't be based on logical reasons. And the same way, this modern idea, like, is science true or is religion true? People back then would just kind of like scratch their heads and, what are they talking about? Because they took it for granted that there's physics and metaphysics. In fact, the whole scientific revolution was led, people like Copernicus, the great astronomers, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and then of course you get Newton. All these people, they were all deeply religious. Where did chemistry come from? It came from alchemy, actually. I mean, we call it alchemy and chemistry, but historically, it's just really the seamless line where alchemy just develops into chemistry. Anyway, I mean, there's a lot I can tell about the history, the influence of other pagan cultures like in Egypt and Persia and Babylonia and everything, and Hermeticism and the effect it had, and all these secret societies because it wasn't Catholic, and it goes back to thousands of years ago, and all the biggest names in the scientific revolution, the biggest names back then in Europe, they were into it. And it had to go underground, and so it kind of popped up with other names like Rosicrucians and Wicca and all these different things. But anyway, so that was a relationship between religion and science, basically. They were just like different departments in the same university. And so what happened is, I said, the printing press, and you get like this explosive combination, which is printing press, age of exploration. Vasco da Gama, Magallanes. In English, they call it Magellan. Anyway, you get all these people, sailing around, discovering the world, making maps. And at the same time they're doing that, there's a printing press. Because it used to be, you had to be really rich to own a library. I mean, libraries were for millionaires. Because you had to write the book out by hand. And it cost a lot of money. And so a library was for a millionaire. Or the church, who were the billionaires. So, so that's who had books. And so since common people couldn't read, I mean, why spend half your annual salary for a book you can't read? Plus, the church, Catholic Church, had a vested interest in people not reading. Because no one actually knew what was in the Bible. All they knew was what the priest told them. And what the priest told them was often out there, as they say. And so, and as far as the only people that could read or who could afford books, which are the nobles and the church, they were in cahoots. That was the power elite. They protected each other. Because the church said, follow the king said, follow the pope, and they were the power elite. They had all the money, they had all the power, and the last thing they want is the common people, who are most people, just bothering them or getting too smart for their own good. And so it was actually, you could be executed for reading the Bible or for translating. For example, the first person, I forget his name, but he who translated the Bible into English in the 1500s. I forget his name, but it's a great translation. In fact, it became the basis for the King James Bible, which may not be super scholarly in every sense, but it's super English. I mean, those guys knew how to write English. Anyway, so the first guy that translated the Bible, Henry VIII, the sociopath, that's when he was still Catholic, before he broke away from the church. And so he went after this guy because only priests can read the Bible. I mean, the princes weren't really that interested in the Bible, and the priests could read it. So this man, who was a learned guy, he fled to Holland, which was, kind of liberal commercial place, and fanaticism isn't good business. So he fled to, I think it was Rotterdam or somewhere. So Henry VIII sent secret agents. This is black ops. I mean, nothing has changed. You look at, the CIA, FBI, the technology is different, but otherwise it's identical. Basically, black ops. He sent these secret agents into Holland, found the guy, arrested him, dragged him back to England, put him on trial, and executed him for the capital offense of allowing people in general to read the Bible. And so in the church, you had all these sacraments, like, okay, the wafer is the body of Jesus, and that's why Romans thought they were cannibals, by the way. This wafer for Triscuit, or this wafer is the body of Jesus, and the wine is blood, all that stuff. And so, and then all these different sacraments and infant baptism. What happened is Luther is actually kind of this pre-modern, he's this catalyst into the modern world, because what characterizes the modern world is individualism, freedom. And Luther starts to say, well, actually, the Bible talks about the priesthood of all people. I won't go into the all men thing. Don't want to get into that, but the priesthood of all people. In other words, everyone should be holy. Everyone should be a priest. And so he starts telling everybody, you have to read the Bible. And even translates it into German, which, by the way, standardized the German language. I mean, there was, if you know Europe back then, like every county, what we would call a county, I mean, they're tiny compared to California counties. I mean, every little district. It's almost like every neighborhood had their own German, their own English. I mean, mutually unintelligible. Like in England, for example, you probably couldn't really have a conversation with your neighbors that live 15 miles down the road. And so you get the stand with the printing press, you start to get standardized languages around Europe. And so he standardized the German. People start reading the Bible, and they discover two things. Number one, a lot of stuff in the Catholic Church isn't in the Bible. Think Krishna West. So a lot of stuff in the scriptures isn't in the Bible, and a lot of this stuff in the church looks suspiciously like magic, which the church says, wasn't good. So they started to fact check the Vatican. They started to fact check the Vatican. What does the Bible actually say? And then another problem is that the Bible often is actually radical. I mean, the Bible talks about, destroying your enemies who don't accept the one true religion. So what if the Vatican is bogus? Well, it has to be destroyed. Or in the Bible, the whole prophetic section of the Old Testament have all these great prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah, all these great prophets. And what are they famous for? They speak truth to power. In other words, dude, you may be the king, you may be a big priest, but you're wrong, and you're really wrong, and you're actually a jerk. And so you get this. There's a lot of revolutionary stuff, and you get even in the New Testament. You have Jesus talking about like throwing down from their thrones the corrupt kings, and there's all this really combustible stuff in the Old and New Testament. Of course, as long as no one ever read it, didn't matter. But now people are actually reading this stuff. And the church is just like ridiculously corrupt. Everyone knows it. The church is really corrupt. I mean, there's stories about, the Pope sort of sponsoring orgies in the Vatican, and they owned half the land. Now, if you look at Germany, for example, where the Reformation started, if you were a German prince, sorry about that, but that's the price you pay when you're very popular. Let me just tell the person. Okay, back to our matinee or our evening showing. So, what's that? Yeah, so if you look at a map of Germany at the time of the Reformation, there's like dozens of little principalities. And the problem was, of course, it's a land-based economy. This is totally pre-industrial. And so basically, if you have a lot of land, you're rich. And if you don't have a lot of land, you're not rich. I mean, there was a trading class. There were these trading towns that were popping up. And so there was kind of a, pre-industrial, there was this new wealth of traders. But ultimately, the aristocrats, the princes, the nobles, I mean, the really rich people, it was land-based. So even though there was a new wealth coming up, trading class, they were very much subservient to the land-based feudal lords. It was a feudal system, which is land-based. So the problem was that if you were a German prince, probably the Vatican owned at least half, if not more, of your kingdom. And which means that half or most of the wealth from your domain was going to Italy. Now, if you suddenly heard a message from God saying, follow Luther, the fact that you would become fabulously wealthy overnight by rejecting the Vatican, I mean, that's not really why I'm doing this. It's really just, totally about my relationship with God. But anyway, a lot of German princes did get a call from God to tremendously increase their wealth and follow Luther. Now, what's very interesting about Luther is that he was probably the most if you would have known of it, the most inadvertent, the most unintentional catalyst for modernity that you could imagine. Because Luther basically is trying to roll back the Renaissance. He hates the Renaissance. Why? First of all, it's a rebirth of Southern European culture. It's pagan culture. He doesn't want to hear what Aristotle had to say. He doesn't need to read Aristotle. He's got the Bible. And so you get these Protestants who say, and so some of Luther's main slogans were, for example, you'll understand this if you know Spanish, sola scriptura, only scripture, which meant we don't need science, don't need philosophy, pagan philosophy, we just need the Bible. And sola fide, only faith. And this is at a time when the Renaissance is saying, you have to understand, this is like, boom, hitting up against the Renaissance. Because the Renaissance, the very word Renaissance, means that we are all about pagan culture. Sure, we're Christians. Yeah, we're Christians. But we love the architecture, we love the art, we love the sculpture, we love the books. So they're all about pagan culture. They're in love with pagan culture, but they just Christianize it. Whereas Luther is saying, nope. So then with that, now what happens? Now the church, the Catholic Church, has a little problem because it's like, it's not like, oh, I think I lost my car keys. It's more like, whoops, I think I lost that country. You know, when you like, losing an entire country can ruin your whole day. And so what happened is countries that were going Protestant, or principalities or little kingdoms, not just the modern nation states, you know, they were just people who were mutinying. They were leaving the church, whole countries, whole regions of Europe. And so what happened is because of that, and it was kind of more like this. Interestingly, the reason the church started the witch trials is because in the days when the church was a fat and sluggish monopoly, and all this magic and rituals and rites and everything and alchemy, and in around 1490, I think, they rediscovered Hermeticism, which was a huge thing. And so all this non-Christian stuff was pouring in from all over the world, especially because it was the age of exploration and Europe was getting richer. Europe was coming out of the Dark Ages. They were starting to advance in technology, in exploration, and especially because for probably thousands of years, if you were a European, the commercial superhighway, it's like, you know, if there's like a road and, you know, that's where all the traffic is, it costs a lot more to buy a store on that road than if you're out in the middle of nowhere, right? I mean, just like in a university town, if you want to have a restaurant across the street from the campus, you're going to pay a lot more for that. And so the commercial superhighway for thousands of years was the Mediterranean. Because world trade was basically trade between the East and the West. And it, so, you know, they have the Silk Road. They would come from China, you know, India would feed into it. And those were the great civilizations. And that was like most of the world population. So China and India, and then it would kind of, you know, because of the mountains and the desert and all this stuff, it kind of funnels into Constantinople, modern Istanbul, which is why that's why the Romans put their Eastern Empire there, their Eastern capital there, because it was a commercial super city. It's like all roads led to Constantinople. And so Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks, Muslims, around that time. And so that's why people were desperate to find a way to reconnect world trade between the East and West. It's not like, oh, I wish we had spices like they do in the East. You know, they were looking for a spice route. The point is, there had been world trade going on for centuries and centuries. And the world trade was interrupted when Constantinople fell to the Turks, and they started charging high taxes or just blocking the road. And so it was a commercial disaster. It was a commercial disaster. The fall of Constantinople is they needed to find another way to get to the east, to resume normal world trade. And so, some people just went around Africa, like Vasco da Gama. And Columbus, before that, he thought, well, let's just sail around the world. But what happened is when they discovered America, and then South America and Central America and Mesoamerica, it turned out there's a lot more money to be made here than in China and India. Because there you actually have to pay a fair price. Here we can just kill everyone and take it, which was like nice. So, but the fact is that suddenly world trade started moving away from the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic. And the Atlantic Ocean became the new commercial superhighway. So it's just like, imagine if you put your store on this main road where you get amazing foot traffic and everyone drives by there, and suddenly say they put a freeway in and no one goes down that road anymore. Your business dries up. So the new commercial superhighway was the Atlantic Ocean. But with all this money coming in, anyway, so everything's, and this is all during the time of Lord Chaitanya, by the way. The whole world's changing during the time of Lord Chaitanya. So anyway, so this is the point. Because the church had a monopoly, they were kind of lax and easygoing. All this magic was coming in, and all kinds, priests, like your priest, your neighborhood priest, could probably tell you some little potion you could make, if you have a cold, or chant this, abracadabra. Like abracadabra, that's not Christian, but maybe it came from Persia, maybe it came from Babylonia, maybe it came from India or Egypt or wherever it came from, and so Europe was just filled with magic. I mean, think like a famous movie which really depicts that period in Europe, although it's fiction, but really shows you what Europe was like, of course, is Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is all about magic and spells and this and that. And of course, Harry Potter is just the resurgence of Hermeticism and alchemy and magic. That's literally what it is. It's a resurgence of it. But Lord of the Rings is a fairly accurate picture of what Europe was like when the only religion was the Catholic Church. But it was so filled with magic. And then you get these Protestants coming along. Suddenly everyone's reading the Bible, fact-checking the Vatican and saying, oh my God, this is not a true religion, because most of the stuff you do isn't in the Bible. It's not in the Bible. And it was because it was like this sort of tough, no-nonsense, individualistic, every person reads the Bible themselves. That means you have to learn how to read. There's a huge uptick in literacy, which led to the scientific revolution also. But anyway, so people started reading, and they just want to simplify it. Like Luther is like this really no frills, no lace, no nothing, like German guy. Let's just get down to the basics. It's just your relationship with God, and that's personal and individual. And you have to read the Bible, and no one can tell you, and blah, blah, blah. And so you get this really stripped down, mean machine, these Protestant churches. It's just God, and just Jesus, and you, and the rest of the stuff, forget about it. And so at an age which is starting to become more rational because people are reading. And there were always a lot of people, as many as now back then, that had high IQs. And so they're starting to read. Suddenly intelligent people that don't happen to be nobles or priests can actually read books. And so you have this huge swelling, this huge increase in literacy and education. All this is happening. And the idea of a rational Christianity starts to really sound good. A rational, logical Christianity, and just peel off all this magic. So the Catholic Church, trying to show, no, we're not magic, we're really as rational as anybody, that's when they start the witch trials. It's like the best defense is a good offense. So they think, okay, we'll jump out in front of the curve and show people we are the greatest opponents of magic, so let's just go killing witches. Anyway, so all these things are, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, all these things are happening. And so because you have Luther, that says all we need is the Bible. And he's like, he really is a fanatic. He had some interesting ideas, but the kind of thing like, have you been washed in the blood of the Lamb, and basically fanatical Christianity. He's your man. Actually, at the end of his life, not at the very end, but as he got older, he became a rabid anti-Semite because he'd become so inspired by his own powers in God's service that he thought the only reason that all the Jews didn't accept Jesus is because it wasn't presented to them properly. Right, Martin. Yeah, that's probably the reason all the Jews didn't become Christians. So he invited them all to become sort of Lutheran Christians, and for some inexplicable reason, all the Jews didn't follow Luther. Still can't figure that one out. But anyway, so when they didn't follow him, he became this sort of foaming at the mouth anti-Semite, and he greatly inspired people later on, like Hitler. He was another inspiration to Hitler, his anti-Semitism. But anyway, so because Luther is kind of like, all we need is faith, all we need is the Bible. Because everybody's saying we have two books. We have the Bible and the book of nature. We have the book of nature. God created the world. God is a supremely rational being, as I was saying. He has given us a spark of his own divine reason, and we live in a logical universe. By the way, all this stuff you can see is going straight to a scientific revolution. I mean, think of all this stuff. This is coming from the pagans, their logos theory. It comes into Renaissance Christianity and early modern Christianity, and it's a perfect theology for science. That God is not this fanatical, basically psychopath that eternally, that's a very long time, eternally tortures his own children if they commit even relatively minor theological mistakes. And imagine that. Like, okay, imagine devotees, okay, you're my kid, I love you, but you didn't pass the Bhakti Shastri test, so I'm going to have to torture you forever. Forever. I mean, for millions of years, you can be screaming out to me for mercy, and I'm going to keep torturing you forever because you didn't pass the Bhakti Shastri test. I mean, does that sound crazy? I mean, this is really psychopathy, the psychopaths. And so because they had this, only the Bible, all this, and so therefore the church would have actually been a patron of the new science. Because you have to remember, the priests, the bishops and the cardinals, they were the most educated people in Europe. I mean, ever since the Dark Ages, ever since the fall of Rome, it was the priests in the abbeys and monasteries that preserved literacy. They were the scholars. And so, for example, I mean, scientists will never tire of telling us about the trial of Galileo. What they won't tell you is that the Pope, who finally, that what happened is that there was this, I mean, I could look at the names, but there's a Pope Urban the 8th or something. Before he became Pope, he was a friend of Galileo. And when Galileo was first condemned to house arrest, they didn't burn him at the stake. When he was first condemned to house arrest, this person, who then I think it's maybe a cardinal, he opposed it. He was on Galileo's side. He said, no, you shouldn't punish Galileo. We need this kind of free thinking. And and Galileo, part of his punishment in the first trial was he was forbidden to publish books. But the new Pope, because he was, they were besties, the new Pope said to Galileo, hey, write a book. And of course, the hot topic was, is the world geocentric or heliocentric? Do the planets go around the sun or the earth? And there's arguments on both sides. I mean, now, of course, we know the preponderance of evidence is on the heliocentric model, but still, he basically rescinded a major part of Galileo's punishment. He was a friend of Galileo. He had opposed the punishment of Galileo and invited him to publish a book. So what does Galileo do? He was a great scientist in some ways, didn't get really good scores on emotional IQ. So Galileo, in his book, he does what was common then. He puts it in the form of a dialogue, or just various people just talking to each other. And it was a common literary genre back then. And so he has one character called Simplicio, which meant a simpleton. In other words, someone who's really dumb. And the Pope had asked him, maybe in your book you can also include some of my views, because there was a Pope who was a scholar, who appreciated Galileo, who opposed the punishment of Galileo, the trial of Galileo, and asked him to write a book. So what does Galileo do? He has this character called Simplicio, like, the dummy. And this guy, Simplicio, is one that makes all these stupid arguments. And he has Simplicio be the voice of the Pope, giving everyone the impression the Pope is a dummy. And this is his friend who's trying to help him. So, it was game over, Galilei. It was game over. Because, if you have a high position and if people stop believing in you or think you're a fool, your whole civilization collapses. And so he said, that's it. So Galileo actually, if he would have had, a little tiny spoonful of common sense, would have actually gone free eventually and could have practiced science. But scientists will never tell you that, because it sounds better to say that, religion is evil and science is sort of was martyred by evil religion. That's actually the story. So because the Protestants were gaining ground and they just wanted the Bible, the political center was pulled over to the right. In other words, the church could no longer sort of indulge this ocean of magic, which was in the church. They had to kick all that up. They couldn't indulge all this new science, because if they did, they were losing debating points to the Protestants. So the Protestants kind of pulled. So anyway, so the relationship between science and religion really got bad. And of course, all the universities were controlled by the church. There were no secular universities. And then in the 1600s, you have the age of science. That's when really the scientific revolution, the age of reason, the age of science. You get foundational figures like Sir Francis Bacon, who kind of reinvents the scientific method that we still use today. You have Descartes, who is Descartes invented a lot of advanced mathematics. You couldn't have a digital world. A lot of the math that's done in modern science and even digital science actually goes back to Descartes. So the guy was really smart. And he, of course, Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. He tries to prove there's a soul, tries to prove there's God. So you get these, but Descartes, if you read the introduction to his Meditations, which is where he says, I think, therefore I am, and gives a proof for the soul and a proof for God. If you read those Meditations, what you find is he goes out of his way to assure the Sorbonne, that was the main school in France, obviously, under the control of the Vatican. So he, and it's the fathers, like the great theologians, the great doctors, academic leaders of the Sorbonne, who are going to judge Descartes' work and decide whether it's heresy or whether it's okay and all that. So if you read the introduction to his Meditations, he really goes out of his way to say, look, we all know that there's a God. We all know that Jesus is, the Trinity and all that. We know that. But there are some idiots out there that don't accept this obviously divine revelation. And so it's for those fools out there, I have to speak their language. So I'm just going to give it to them without faith, without scripture. I'm just going to logically show them, because that's the only language they speak. Which is interesting. It means that even in the 1600s, there was a significant number of intellectuals that didn't buy all this fanaticism. And of course, also, it wasn't lost on Descartes that other great thinkers have been burned at the stake, like Giordano Bruno. And, Descartes was not in the mood to be burned at the stake. And anyway, so he says all that. And so Descartes, because what had happened is Galileo had basically, he blew up Aristotelian cosmology. Because Aristotle's thing was that there's, there's like heavenly worlds and everything goes around the earth. Then you had Copernicus. By the way, Copernicus, the reason the church actually asked Copernicus to figure out what's up there in the heavens, because they were all using Ptolemaic astronomy, Ptolemy's astronomy, going back to Egypt. Basically he was sort of a descendant of a general of Alexander the Great, who conquered Egypt, and so he was just a Greek guy, in Alexandria. And so he figured out this astronomy, like how all the planets go around the earth, all the stars, sun, everything goes around the earth. And he was a genius mathematician. And he did such a good job that actually no one really bothered thinking about it again for over 1,000 years, because the math was really great. The only problem is that his calculation of how much time a day is like, I forget, it's 11 seconds or a minute or 11 minutes. It was a little off. I mean, not by much. And so therefore, after 1,000 years passed, the church couldn't figure out when Easter was. They couldn't figure out when Christmas was. They actually couldn't figure it out, and so the church went to Copernicus and said, could you figure this out? We need more precise calculations. Copernicus had a personal reason. He thought that if, this is a great Copernican revolution, that if we have more accurate calculation of planetary motion, we can do a lot better astrology. So Copernicus actually wanted to get more efficient astrology. So if you look at the scientific revolution, it's not like nowadays, like, there's nothing but matter. It's exactly the opposite. But anyway, so now what I'm saying is that we have to go back to that, what, for example, was called the Newtonian synthesis. Newton spent most of his time actually doing alchemy and doing kind of hermetic projects. And that's what you get, by the way, hermetically sealed, because they say that Hermes, the original founder, figured out how to seal the containers through scientific experiments. But anyway, so all these people, I mean, Robert Boyle, B-O-Y-L, was a friend of Newton, considered the first chemist in the modern sense, not just alchemist. He was totally into alchemy. I mean, he was, if you actually look at the scientific revolution, all these scientists, and going into the 1700s and even 1800s, 1900s, they were religious. What's it? Tycho Brahe. Tycho Brahe was a Danish noble he actually made calculations of planetary motion 5 times more accurate than anyone had done. And, he was religious. And he was a guy who was actually a friar. It was, one of them was actually a priest, these great scientists. So, anyway, so historically, and they were inspired. For example, Copernicus was inspired by Plato. And that's how he figured out that the earth goes around the sun. He was thinking in Platonic terms of the sun, is because Plato talks about the sun, the symbol of light, the symbol of everything. So actually, Copernicus put his money on a heliocentric solar system because he thought it matches what Plato said. And if you look at all these people, they not only were scientists and they were religious, their religion actually inspired them. That's what inspired them, with the idea that we live in a lawful universe. The universe is not chaotic, ultimately. It's governed by laws. Why? Because it's made by a supremely rational being. And that's why it's governed by laws. And because God has put that divine reason within us, therefore we can figure out, we can decipher how the universe works. The reason we can figure it out, because God made it in a logical way, and that same logic is within us. And that's why all these branches of science are called ologies. Physiology, biology, geology, and all that. Why? It was all based on logos theory, on the idea of divine reason in the mind of God being communicated to his creatures, and then those creatures using that logos to discover the logos in the natural world. And so how science became atheistic and what actually have that's a whole story, which I can't have time for now. But that, you know, that gets into the, for one thing, I'll just give you a few little tidbits of how science became atheistic. It started where all good ideas start in France. And what happened is that England was way ahead of France. That's not just because I speak English. In the sense that in England, they had the Glorious Revolution of 1689, where they actually deposed a Catholic monarch because he was a Catholic, James II. They didn't want any more fanatical Catholics, because the Catholics had actually colluded. This is real collusion. This is not fake news. Actually colluded with the Pope to overthrow the Protestant King of England. And that was high treason. And in fact, there had been a law that any Catholic priest who came to England from Europe and was found to be teaching would be executed. So they're very serious. Because in 1588, the Spanish Armada, the largest military fleet in the history of the world, with innumerable blessings from the Pope, of course, with cow dung and all the ships, but just kidding. But anyway, the Spanish Armada attacked England, and they would have obliterated England. I mean, literally, England was spared by, that's a whole other story, why the Spanish Armada didn't conquer England. But anyway, so, I mean, England had attacked, under the Pope, the Pope's armies through Spain had attacked Holland to get rid of all the Protestants. So it was, I mean, England was fighting for its life against Vatican-inspired armies. And so, what was I getting to before that? So in France, though, it didn't work. In France, they had a Catholic monarchy. And not only did they have a Catholic monarch, this is really the seeds of the French Revolution and everything that led up to it. The French monarch happens to be my friend and yours, Louis XIV, the absolutist monarch, who built Versailles. He was asked, like, what's your system of government by an ambassador? He, you know, famously said, L'État, c'est moi. The state, it's me. He was an absolutist monarchy. No Magna Carta, no sharing of power, not as it used to be in Europe, primo inter pares. The king is the first among equals, among nobles. He was an absolutist monarch, absolute power. And so politically, you had this totalitarian regime, and then that completely colluded with the Catholic Church, and they had actually Protestantism, Calvinism, because Calvin was in Geneva, which is right there, sticking into the middle of southern France. And so you had a significant Calvinist, you had a significant Protestant community in France. And so there was a whole neighborhood in Paris that was Protestant. So one day the king, this is even before Louis XIV, they just sent in the army, sealed off the neighborhood, and killed everyone, men, women, and children. And they even had the Edict of Nantes. Because of all this fighting, they had this Edict of Nantes, which I think at the end of the 1500s, which was an agreement between the French throne and the Protestants that they could have rights in France, they could live in peace, they wouldn't be killed, but just, stay out of our way. So that was called the Edict of Nantes, which guaranteed Protestants in France, they could just stay alive and just live in France. And so Louis XIV revoked that. He revoked the Edict of Nantes. So that if you were a Protestant in France, you had no rights at all. And then so you have this fanatical church, you have this fanatical, and so what happened is, in France, where you have all these intellectuals, it's the pendulum effect. They get radicalized, and for them, even Newton, because Newton was very religious, or at least very spiritual, they don't even want Newton. Why? Because Newton is religious, Sir Isaac Newton is religious, and anything religious just empowers our enemies. Because the church, they're like the caretakers of God in France. And so therefore they become radicalized. It's like they become the equal and opposite extreme. As absolutist, as fanatical, as extremist as the church and the throne were in France, they became the equal and opposite extreme. Atheistic, hating religion. In the French Revolution, they killed the priests. And so whereas in England, you have this Newtonian synthesis where everybody's getting along, and you have moderate politics, you actually start to have constitutional government, you have religious freedom, and because of that, that's why the Industrial Revolution happens in England, and that's why England, keeps winning the wars against France and becomes the richest country in the world and the most powerful country in the world, because they're the ones who are doing the most to promote science and reason and ingenuity and invention. Whereas in France, they don't want Newton, and the French nobles don't want the Industrial Revolution, because the traditional power base of the nobles is land. They live on the land. And it's the lower classes that build factories. They don't want an industrial revolution because they don't want to enrich the lower classes. So France pushes back, the leaders push back. And so in that atmosphere, the intellectuals in France are going crazy. They're just going nuts. They can't get jobs in the universities. Voltaire, what does Voltaire do? He goes to England. And so they can't get jobs in universities. They're just totally shut down. And so you start to get this extremely radical, atheistic, hateful, intellectual underground. And finally, it just explodes into the French Revolution, which was awful. But that mood, and so this idea of religion as the enemy of science, religion as the enemy of a rational life, religion as dogmatic, as fanatical, religion is just the enemy of just human reason. It really comes from France. And then the next thing, so how do you get, Darwin's bulldog in England, Thomas Huxley, is because science starts to get so much power and so much credibility that the same thing happens to them that happened to the church. Power corrupts. They become as corrupt and as fanatical as the old medieval church used to be, and they start denying, they start saying, and then the modern manifestation is a complete bozo the clown, like that guy Dawkins, who, as I always say, breaks the first rule of scholarship, which is you don't speak outside your area of expertise. That's the quickest way to make an ass out of yourself in academics, is start talking about things you haven't really studied. That's not your field, isn't it? And so he hasn't studied theology, philosophy of religion, history of religion, sociology of religion. He talks about it all the time. He doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about, I just gave you a sort of a, I'm going to obviously have to really cut this down, but this is just like the half of it. And then what happened is science is on a roll. I'll just finish it real quickly. Science is on this big roll. They're just taking over. They have the power. They start to control the schools. It's not like before that unless you're part of the church establishment, you can't teach in a university. Now it's the opposite. If you are religious, you can't teach in a university. Payback. And so what happens is science becoming more and more powerful. They seem to just have all the answers to everything. And just like all the sciences and all the different fields of study used to be called handmaidens to theology. Theology, the science of God, as taught by the church, that was the center of knowledge and education. And if you were in any other field, you were just serving that. And which is, frankly, that's what ISKCON does. The real knowledge is Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam. So if you're a geologist, or if you're a biologist, or if you're a historian, you're just trying to use it in Christian service. So all the different fields of knowledge, same thing in Europe, not ancient, but medieval Europe and early modern, and in the Renaissance, that all the fields of knowledge were meant to serve theology. But then it flips. And now religion is just a branch of academics, because everything is material, everything is deterministic, everything is like science, even though human beings have free will, and therefore psychology is not a hard science, it's a soft science. Sociology is a soft science, because you can only have a hard science when everything's deterministic, when everything is predictable, necessary causes and effects. But you can't have predictable, necessary causes and effects when you're studying people that have free will. And so therefore, in this attempt to colonize religion and subjugate religion, they come out with these crazy ideas that actually we don't really have free will. And if you knew enough about neurology and if you knew enough about psychology, you could predict what people would do. And actually consciousness is just an epiphenomenon. It's sort of like something that burped out of, you know, your neurological system. It's also material. And so you get this, just like the church, fanatical church tried to colonize and subjugate everything and everyone. Now, then you had science doing the same thing, trying to subjugate everyone. And you may think you're talking about a soul, you may think you're talking about God, but you're really just a branch of material science. Maybe psychology, maybe psychopathology, which, by the way, that's what Freud called it, psychopathology. That's what religion is. You didn't have a good relationship with your father, so you project this big father up in the sky. So anyway, it's so all these things are going on, but then what happens? Then something else happens. Just when science things like it owns everything, and there's all these predictions and prophecies, the end of religion, the end of all this stuff, they hit a brick wall called quantum mechanics. Because you've heard of the wave particle problem. And that is, just very briefly, when, it's just like, let's say, for example, you're walking, let's say I want to see how long it takes you to walk across a football field, 100 yards, and I'm timing you. Obviously, the fact that I'm watching you, or if no one's watching you, it makes no difference in terms of the basic physics of it. You're going at this speed, this distance, so, you know, it's, right? It's middle school math. But what happens, by the way, quantum mechanics means subatomic physics. That means things that are smaller than atoms, subatomic particles. So subatomic physics is quantum mechanics. The problem is that when you watch these little subatomic particles like photons and neutrons and electrons, by the way, that's what the word electronic means, electrons. So actually one of the benefits of quantum mechanics was electronics. So if I say something wrong, correct me, and then I will curse you. But I mean, it'll ruin your life, but that's okay. It's a price you have to pay. So the problem is that when you look at these particles, they behave differently than when you don't look at them, isn't it? And they've tried I mean, believe me, the most brilliant, genius physicists in the world for almost 100 years have been trying to figure this out, and they can't. They just hit a wall. They hit a wall. Because then you think back of all the magic which they rejected, which said that mind over matter, right? That was the whole thing they rejected. That it's really about, why is there a physical world at all? Because the mind of God, that above all physical things is consciousness. And they're like, they just threw that out. That's magic, it's nonsense, it's primitive superstition, has no place in the modern world. Suddenly, at the most sophisticated branch of physics, minds are changing the way material particles behave. And, right? And they can't figure it out. And then what's his name? The uncertainty principle. Starts with an H. What's his name? You know, everyone knows. No, everyone, he's very famous. Heisenberg. Yeah. So what Heisenberg showed mathematically that you cannot figure this out, because just the way it is, the more you know about the location of a particle, the less you know about its velocity. And the more you know about its velocity, the less you know about its location. And I'm not a quantum physicist, but somehow or other, he convinced everyone that it's baked in the cake. You can't fix it. It's called Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And then in the 1920s, the most famous quantum physicist in the world, Niels Bohr, who's like, you know, is like almost like a Newton figure. I mean, Niels Bohr and Heisenberg himself, they had this meeting in Copenhagen. and they came to this thing called the Copenhagen understanding. In other words, this is how we understand quantum physics, because it was just so like magical. This is how we understand. What they said is that physics, and they said this 100 years ago, it hasn't filtered down yet to all the knuckle-dragging pseudo-intellectuals down here. But what they said almost 100 years ago is that physics no longer claims a one-to-one correspondence. They use the word correspondence, which is picked up by postmodernism. We no longer claim precise correspondence between our equations, our descriptions, and what's really out there. All we can say is the equations work, the math works, you know, you get a computer, you get electronic things. Yeah, that's all we can say, is that it helps us to calculate certain things that have valuable applications, you know, applied science. And that's all we can say. We no longer claim that this is a description of what the real world is. And what's interesting is that Einstein rejected that idea. I mean, he rejected the idea. I mean, he didn't reject the idea that they couldn't figure it out. He knew they couldn't figure it out. But what Einstein said, and this is where he broke with quantum mechanics. I mean, he accepted quantum mechanics, but he said that, that's when he said God doesn't play dice, you know, with the universe. What he's saying is that ultimately the best possible scientific theory will in fact correspond to an objective world. It will describe the real world. And if right now you have a theory which doesn't describe the real world, you can't figure out whether it's a wave or a particle. It's just, and plus they had another problem. What do you call that remote communication? They call it non-locality. Yeah, entanglement, non-locality. What they found is that there's like, what is it? Electrons have positive and negative charges, isn't it? And so what is the positive? Is the protons. So okay, if you have two particles. So if you have two particles, if you have two particles and one's negative and one's positive, you know, if the other one becomes positive, the other one becomes negative.
Alert from System UI server.
Oh.
Look.
In other words, the particles affect each other. And so what they found is you can take particles and put them like, you know, like 10 miles apart, and they still do that. That particles that are 10 miles apart, and you can measure, there's no, you know, energy going between them. They're just 10 miles apart. Like the tiniest little subatomic particles, 10 miles apart, are communicating with each other constantly. And every time because you can change the charge on a particle, right? So every time you flip the charge, the other one flips. So they're actively communicating with each other over a fairly long period of time, and they're 10 miles apart. What's that? Spin, yeah.
The charge thing.
Okay, the spin. Well, okay, the spin, thank you. It's a good thing you're telling us for Florida. Okay, it's the spin, everybody out there. And so therefore, it's starting to get like, almost like this voodoo science. You know, like when you look at it, it's a particle. When you don't look, it's a wave. That they, you know, these two tiny, I mean, tiny little particles are actually talking to each other, and they're 10 miles apart. And so that's when you started to get these books coming out, like the Dancing Woolly Masters and the Zen of, you know, motorcycle repair. So you got all these books in the 60s because the people started to realize, hey, this is like Buddhism, or this is Zen. And so there was like, it became a fad for a while, like comparing Buddhism, Zen to quantum mechanics, but they just hit this wall, and they can't get past that wall. And they can no longer claim they know what the universe really looks like at a subatomic level. And the last thing I'm going to say, because my battery's running out and I got work to do, that the point I'm going to make, so I'll pass it on you, is that ultimately it doesn't matter. Because the universe is teleological. Telos in Greek means a purpose or a goal. In other words, a simple example I always give, let's say you go to a museum and look at a beautiful painting. So you ask a simple question, who really understands that painting? Is it a qualified art historian, or is it a chemist that knows about paint? Now, according to modern science, it's not the art historian, it's the chemist, which is absurd. Because the painting is teleological. In other words, someone made it for a purpose. The reason, let's say, the sky is orange in this painting is because the artist wanted you to see an orange sky. It's not orange because it has certain chemicals. The chemicals are there because of the artist's intention. So it's not orange because of the chemicals. The chemicals are there because of the intention. And so therefore, it's like, for example, I'm not into computer engineering. I'm seriously not into it. And so when I turn my computer on, if the screen comes on and I can do my work, and if you say to me, do you want to know how that's happening? No, please don't tell me, because I'll probably get a headache. I mean, I really appreciate it. I admire people that do it. I'm grateful to them. Do I want to know about it? No, I just want my computer to work. And if I'm in a museum looking at a great work of art and someone says, hey, do you want to know about the chemistry? I don't think so. So in the same way, you know, wave, particle, wavicle, as some people say now, it actually doesn't matter unless for your own amusement, you're interested in those things, or because you want to, you know, do applied science, make a lot of money, you know, with applied science. But in terms of basically, when you look up at the sky and it's blue, it was meant to be blue. God made it blue because that was his artistic sensitivity. And so when you look at a blue sky, that's the reality of it. It's not that the reality of it is atmospheric science, refracted sunshine. No, that's just the nuts and bolts. That's just the machinery of it. I really have no interest in paint chemistry, but I do find art interesting. So in the same way, why is the sky blue? Because God made it that way, because it was an artistic choice. And so that's what's really important about the sky. Finding God in the sky, understanding his artistic decisions. That's what's most important about the sky. And all the atmospheric science is valuable for applied science. And it's interesting for people to just have that kind of intellectual curiosity. But in terms of coming to the deepest understanding of why the sky is blue, it's kind of irrelevant. Unless it's just like Newton. We can agree with Newton. It's just an opportunity to admire that God's a real brainiac, you know, and then he can make stuff like that. So anyway, that's like a very quick little synopsis of my thing. Vote for a charity is a vote for sound theology. Okay, I'd like to thank everyone out there in Facebook land. Thank you for hanging in there. I hope you followed all this stuff. And may all your chapatis be buttered. Sorry. If you had to do all this intellectual stuff, you'd get pretty silly too. Okay, thank you all very much. Hare Krishna. And